Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining our virtual event on climate and peace in the Middle East. Over the next 90 minutes or so, we will explore how climate action can support peace-building objectives in the Middle East. My name is Thomas Ritzer. I'm the Senior Advisor on Climate and Peace at the Berghof Foundation, and I have the pleasure of moderating this conversation here today. Now, the Middle East is among the regions most affected by the confluence of climate vulnerability and insecurity. Soaring temperatures, drought, and desertification are interwoven with population movements and conflict dynamics. On top of that, the region's deep ties to hydrocarbons also shape politics and create their own implications for peace and security. So there clearly is a massive need for climate action in the Middle East, both mitigation and adaptation. But political and security challenges, as well as a shortage of finance, have been hampering those efforts. According to the World Bank, the Middle East is actually the region that receives the least amount of climate finance of any region in the world. That's not necessarily surprising, of course, since we know that climate finance tends to shy away from regions that are fragile or affected by conflict. But it is this inaction on climate that can really create a downward spiral of climate disasters and conflict that could trap countries and prevent their path to peace and prosperity. On the flip side, and this is something the UN Secretary General has said on a few occasions already, climate action and peace building can and should reinforce each other. However, those integrated approaches, they don't happen by accident, they happen by design. They need to be deliberate and on purpose. And this is what we want to discuss today about the Middle East. How can we design such deliberate processes that maximize our co-benefits between peace building and climate action, and how can we mobilize climate finance to support such efforts? We have a stellar cast of experts with us today on the panel. First is Natasha Hall. She's a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Natasha has over 15 years of experience working in and on the Middle East, including on climate and peace issues. Thanks, Natasha, for joining us. We also have Dr. Hassan Janabi, who is the former Minister of Water Resources of Iraq. He's also served as Iraq's ambassador to Turkey, Japan, and the UN agencies in Rome. Dr. Hassan, thanks for joining us. We have Jay Collins, who is the Vice Chairman of Banking at Citi, and Citi's Senior Banker for Governments globally. He has more than 30 years of experience in public and climate finance and advises governments on these issues all over the world. Hello, Jay. Thanks so much for joining us. And we have Andrew Gilmour, the Executive Director of the Berghof Foundation. He previously worked at the United Nations for 30 years and has held a number of senior appointments, including in the Middle East and most recently also as Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. Andrew also recently published the book, The Burning Question, Climate and Conflict, Why Does It Matter? So Andrew will be able to share some of the findings and takeaways from the research that went into this remarkable book and share them with us today. The book is actually downloadable for free on the Berghof website, and we'll make sure to put the link to the download into the chat later during this event. Thanks, Andrew, for joining us. Following the opening conversation with our panelists, there will be a chance for Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button, and we invite all participants to ask questions through that Q&A function throughout the event. We will make sure to convey them to our panelists at the end of the panel segments. You also have a chance to vote up the questions that you think are most relevant. So please feel free to express what you think are the most relevant questions, and we will make sure to ask them to our panelists at the end of the opening segment. Now, without further ado, I think we'll jump right in. Natasha, I'd like to start with you. You've worked on climate and environmental issues in the Middle East and their linkages with peace and security for a number of years now. In your view, how can climate action promote peace building, and how can investments in climate resilience support prospects for peace in the Middle East?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Berghof Foundation. So I think actually the question we're asking ourselves today is quite a loaded one, given the state of the Middle East today. I think putting all of this on climate change peace building is going to be difficult. Now, I think climate change can be an avenue to achieve peace, and it can, I mean, it logically should, but it often doesn't in the Middle East. And I don't think it's simply a matter of financing. But why should it? Let's ask that question first. And I think it's because not coordinating to adapt to climate change or to mitigate climate change and use our increasingly scarce resources sustainably is bad for us in almost every way. Sand and dust storms in the Middle East cost $13 billion a year, from economic losses to health consequences. The Dead Sea in Jordan has dropped the equivalent of a 6-story building since 2000. So we're talking about billions of dollars in losses. But somehow, I think what we see is that climate change, water and environmental management isn't leading to sustainable peace, no matter how much we talk about it. And I don't think it's that difficult to explain why. And I'm going to use a little bit of game theory here to explain why climate change should allow communities and nations to come together to address this existential issue. But I think game theory also explains why that isn't really happening at the moment and what needs to happen to ensure that. So in a typical prisoner's dilemma, you have 2 prisoners in separate rooms, and they must decide if they're going to confess to a crime. If one confesses and the other doesn't, he gets off, and the other goes to jail for a long time. If they both confess, they both get several years, and if neither confess, they get lesser sentences. So the latter is the best or better outcome for both. In other words, cooperation is better for all, but selling somebody else out is better for you. So if we turn this dilemma to climate change and water diplomacy, most communities would benefit from cooperation. We know this. Sustainable water use would protect affordable drinking water for millions of people in the region. It would save billions in lost livelihoods, environmental and health effects. This is why we're having this discussion today, because we know that climate change should logically be a place, an entry point for peace in the Middle East. But that said, it's quite hard to compete with those that get a more direct, immediate benefit. I talked about billions of losses every year, but the reality is that Saudi Arabia makes more than $1 billion a day in oil revenues, and Iraq makes 1/3 of that a day in a good year. So they win, but many, many other actors lose. So using game theory, how do you get prisoners in different rooms to cooperate? Well, cooperation requires communication and information exchange among the players. Players must share information about their preferences and resources and constraints to identify opportunities for mutual gain. And that's what we really need to do, because there needs to be a history of cooperation, or at least trust building, to enable actors to consistently make choices that benefit everybody. And that's not what we have in the Middle East today. We have built up mistrust, lack of social cohesion between and across borders. And this heavily favors the scenario where you sell out all others for your own benefit. And it's getting worse, frankly. I mean, we have years of conflict and mistrust that have been built up between communities and their governments, between central and local governments, and between governments themselves. And in such an environment, it sort of makes logical sense to do what's best for you in the current moment. And that might mean using water unsustainably or polluting. But I would argue, and I hope we can talk about this today, that we're getting closer to the end of that rope. I mean, in the Middle East, an increasing number of people are losing. Farmers are losing crops, cattle, urban residents are suffering from a lack of safe water. The number of people getting by or profiting from the current situation, so we're talking about powerful agribusinesses, politicians, upstream communities, is a shrinking number of people. And this has led to major crises, from the Basra water crisis in 2018, which I'm sure Dr. Hassan will speak to chronic cholera outbreaks, to the collapse of energy grids in energy-rich countries like Libya. And we've seen mass protests and fires in the street. And so I think that the powers that be are actually creating the elements of their own demise. So I think for climate change to be a catalyst for peace, and I'll conclude here, there's 2 elements that need to exist. I think all parties need to see the benefit of this cooperation, and they need to be able to directly attribute climate change and environmental degradation to their own potential demise. And that will hopefully support equitable and sustainable cooperation. And I think to improve that cooperation in the meantime, you need to build up trust through consistency and positive outcomes. And that means everyone has to obey by certain regulations. It can't just be certain communities while other communities get off. And a real world example of this would be Iraq's efforts to close down illegal fish farms. They were successful in closing down thousands of them, but somehow Najaf and Karbala got off. And so we need to understand how to make this a more fair scenario where everyone has the interest in cooperating. And I think at the transboundary level, the reason for upstream, riparians cooperation may not even be climate change. It may be international pressure, other forms of cooperation like security and trade, but they need to see the positive outcomes as a result of that cooperation. So I hope we can talk about the actual examples of this later on in the webinar, but I do think there are avenues, but I do think we need to be a little bit realistic on what climate change could potentially do to achieve peace in the current environment.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Natasha. Thanks also for the numbers you provided to give us a sense of what we're talking about, but also the doses of reality and the limitations of collaboration in the real world. That is certainly very interesting, and also the elements you think are needed to actually get the peace and climate benefits out of this work that we all like to see. Dr. Hassan, I would next like to turn to you. You have consistently argued for the importance of investing in climate resilience in fragile environments, including in the UN Security Council in New York a few years ago. And as the former Minister of Water Resources in Iraq, you've walked the talk, basically. You have implemented some of those large-scale projects in a volatile context. So in your experience, how can decision makers navigate these uncertainties and create the conditions to overcome those challenges, and keeping in mind perhaps also what Natasha just said in terms of the difficulty of actually getting collaboration off the ground? How have you done it, and how do you think it can be done? Dr. Hassan, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks to everybody in this distinguished panel. Thanks to Natasha, very happy to be with her as well, and also to listen to her remarks. You reminded me of my presentation to the Security Council, and that was really a very, very good moment for me personally, and also for Iraq and the communities that have some concern with the climate change. Of course, Iraq is not a perfect example for climate and environmental resilience. It is, in fact, is a country that is very, very, very vulnerable to climate change, and that climate change is manifested dramatically in heat waves hitting the country. That, as we speak right now in June is the current temperature here is 6 degrees above the long-term average. So you can imagine the impact of this heat. And also people see the changes in terms of declining water resources, dramatically declining water resources. Iraq used to enjoy, plentiful of water. It's not anymore for the last 40 years, and it is continue to decline. So the challenges facing Iraq are really unusual. They are very, very formidable. So, but Iraq as a society is resilient, and is resilient due to endless wars that engulfed the country for the last 40 years. However, when it comes to the environment, is not that this does not apply to the to the environment, because Iraq's survival during these tragedies in the last 40 years came basically at the expense of the environment. People are struggling with their life, so of course they care about their well-being, their families, and what have you. So as a country that has been in a state of war for decades, the destruction of horrific proportion, and beside the wars and the war's destruction, we had witnessed like a decade long of severe economic embargo that basically destroyed even the social fabric. So since 2003, we have we have a different government. We have changed nearly everything, the political system. We have a constitution. But since then, and we are now in 2024, as more than 20 years, the country is still in a transition. And we also invented a political system that our politicians, which does sustainable policies addressing the major challenges in the country. So we have changed the system from a very, very highly central government into a decentralized form of government, but we did not really thought this transition thoroughly, and even the American occupation did not help in this, because they found it like an easy way out of the occupation. So when it comes to how to invest in climate resilience, I would probably suggest first and foremost that Iraq need to be assisted in restoring its basic services. So we still lack these basic services. Drinking water is in trouble. Electricity is in this, we are lucky in this place. We have electricity 12 hours per day, 2 hours electricity and then 2 hours off. And this is after 21 years of the removal of the former dictator. And during this period, Iraq has invested many, many billions of dollars to improve electricity and basic services, but still we cannot do that. So drinking water and sanitation is in terrible shape. Electricity and power is in terrible shape, and also the stability of the country is not helping, because the quota system, political system, the next government does not build on the achievement of the previous government, because it could come from a different political, affiliation and what have you. And this is a tragedy for Iraq, and tragedy also, it is very difficult also for the international community to find an entry point, whether it's including climate change or other challenges, that face the country and the region. So in addressing climate change, in these conditions, climate change is addressing the climate change is a long-term approach. And climate change is not like a project that has a beginning and end, that you allocate certain resources and what have you, and then you do a climate change project that starts and then finish and then you hand over and go. No, climate change is a continuous, just like the issue of food security. Food security cannot be achieved once and for all. So food security issue is something that is continuous. So the entire approach of the government need to focus on on the adaptation, for example, type of projects. Iraq has plenty of money, at least recently, but the money has not necessarily been allocated or spent on projects that are in line with the adaptation obligation of the country, although Iraq has the so-called nationally determined contributions and what have you. Because everything's moving. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of movement, a lot of migration. I mean, partially related also to climate change, this migration or displacement of rural people to major cities. Cities cannot cope with millions of people moving inside a city of Baghdad, the infrastructure of which is to serve like 2.5 million maximum. Now there's more than 8 million people living there. The city of Najaf, where I live right now, is also, I don't know, the infrastructure here are very, very weak, with millions of people and also millions and millions of people visiting this place for religious purposes. So I'm not sure if I consumed my time, Thomas, but yeah, I mean, as I said, Iraq is lacking the adaptive capacity, and any form of contributing to resilience, climate resilience, economy, it needs to address these issues, starting with basic services. Unless we have really these services up and running, then the people cannot think of, be sensitive to the environment or to what have you. Thank you.
Dr. Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. A very real-life perspective on the challenges climate change creates for a country like Iraq. And also helpful to sort of look at the political dimension as well as the technical dimension of the challenges that we are facing when trying to implement climate action in such environments. So thank you for that perspective. Jay, I'd like to come to you next and build on some of those technical questions that Dr. Hassan has also mentioned in terms of navigating challenges to implement climate action. Mobilizing finance is one of those challenges, and in your experience with climate finance and public finance in so many different countries around the world, what are the obstacles that you see to getting climate finance into fragile settings, in particular private finance, and how can we overcome those challenges? What have you seen, and what ideas do you have to overcome the challenge of providing climate finance in these settings?
Thank you, and thank you for including me today. Let me put things in a context, kind of a Churchillian promise or peril context that I've used over the years. But I think starting with the promise, and it's something that Andrew talks about in his book quite a bit, which is water and the co-benefits of water. And I think that one has to look at the current negotiations in Baku over the lack of adaptation monies and the dramatic need for adaptation monies, and at the same time the failure to move development capitals for the non-climate SDGs to the developing world, and how with the paucity of the fiscal coffers in the OECD countries, how can we make a case that this is essential? And I think that the water is the promise, and it is certainly in my view and City's view, it is perhaps the highest co-benefit SDG out there, and particularly related to conflict, and particularly in the region that we're talking about. But it's just not happening, and so one has to look at what we can do to better make the case. We have to move away from this either or choice between adaptation, climate money, and development money. I think we need to put at the peace table the investment prospects and climate adaptation strategies, so that there is a track specifically focused on that. And in that track, at that table, we definitely need financiers that can talk about what is private sector appropriate, what is public sector only appropriate. Not all adaptation is only public sector appropriate. There are strategies, as we've seen in water, that are high-tech technology, additionality, and where the math can attract the private sector. But as you rightfully say, the more fragile you get, the harder this gets. And unfortunately, in the climate world, coming out of Glasgow, where people talked about all of this pool of developed world capital that is available to support climate. Well, the truth is most of that, be it pension money, bank money, insurance money, is wrapped around a fiduciary or regulatory world of investment grade, meaning that the weak credit zip codes are much harder to get to. And the weaker you get and the more fragile you get, the harder it is to mitigate the risk to drive that capital there. And so that leads you to oftentimes in the fragile states abandon the private sector. I do think that's a mistake. I do think that we should hold out the carrot of potential investment, prosperity, development in an enabling environment that envisions peace and what that could mean. We at Citi, for example, work with companies that have stayed in conflict zones around the world or political strife, difficult places. And there are corporations that are there, that are on the ground, that continue to do business, and that would potentially do more in the event of peace, and that understand also that if adaptation investment doesn't happen, that effectively not only will the country be stranded, as we say in financial terms, meaning that there will be these tipping points where investors will just leave, because if you become obviously, if the climate moves away from you, you can become uninsurable, unbankable, and uninvestable. And so to stop that train wreck, what's required is clearly the adaptation strategy. And in this case, conflict meets water meets adaptation strategies that will drive an alternative scenario and plan toward that. And I don't think we're doing as much as we need to make that case. And therefore, making the water as a core theme toward the opportunity of the co-benefits is something that I think we're absolutely going to need to do here.
Thanks very much, Jay, for this. Thanks also for highlighting just the different ways of thinking about public finance versus private finance, and that there is indeed a way to also make adaptation work for private finance, and the need to engage more on that front. Water is, as you said, a really good example of that. And Andrew, that brings me to you. You recently published the book, The Burning Question, an excellent wide-reaching discussion of the climate conflict linkages and the pathways they're connected to. You talk a lot about the risks, of course, and how climate change and environmental change can undermine peace and security. But you also talk about opportunities of collaboration, and you talk a lot about water. A lot of politics come around in this book as well in terms of the different elements of the climate conflict nexus. And you also mentioned that climate action is not guaranteed to make peace necessarily. It's a complicated case, especially in fragile and conflict-affected situations. Can you explain a little bit in the Middle East context and what you've seen in your work in the Middle East and your research for your book? What are the risks of climate action in the Middle East? How can it perhaps backfire if not done correctly? What are we looking at here?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Hassan, Jay, and Natasha for joining us today. Yeah, indeed, risks. I mean, there are a number of countries in the Middle East who basically, I would say, are in a double bind when it comes to climate change, basically combating climate change on two major fronts. On the one hand, of course, we have those who are directly impacted by climate change, where you have, for example, the rise of the Islamic State or communal tensions that are increasing as a result of the ongoing pressure of resources on farmland and on water and all of those other natural resources. On the other hand, you also have countries that I would say are more indirectly affected, by which I mean those countries that are affected by or going to be massively affected by the energy transition. And as you say, I have a chapter in my book on the energy transition and the conflict risks that are associated with the energy transition. Because, of course, here we're talking about countries not like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates that have vast sovereign wealth funds, but countries like Iraq and Libya that do not, but where 90% of their government revenues are dependent on fossil fuels, which means that they use those, understandably, they use those fossil fuel revenues for everything from sort of subsidies to providing water, to providing jobs, to providing security for the people. So what happens when that social contract fractures? And of course, it's very good news that that the entire world is going to have to move away towards renewable energy, away from fossil fuels. Good news for the planet, but it's not very good news for countries such as Iraq and Libya, where there's going to be, frankly, a desperate need to diversify the economy so that you move away from the situation whereby 90% of all revenues are dependent on producing oil, because there is a major, one hopes, energy transition coming down the road, whereby all of us wean ourselves away from the drug of fossil fuel and move towards renewables. But if countries that are already deeply mired in conflicts, not right now in the case of Iraq, but it's had terrible conflict over the last 20 years, and Libya, where there is still major ongoing conflicts going on. But if they cannot move away with the help of other countries, or either the private sector or those other Arab countries that do have huge reserves that could be deployed to help other Arab countries get out of their sort of total dependence on fossil fuels, I think without that, we're talking a very serious separate set of risks for such countries.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's again a doses of reality here. How it's not all roses, not all guaranteed to work out. It's a lot of risks involved as well with climate policy in some of these contexts, as Natasha was saying earlier as well. And thanks again also for outlining this so clearly in your book. As you said, there's a whole chapter on energy transition, which really illuminates this conversation specifically. Natasha, coming back to you, you'd already mentioned in your first intervention the two elements needed, you think, to have climate action work for peace, that all parties see the benefits of cooperation and that they also perceive climate change as one of the reasons of their own demise, if you will. So I'd like to ask you now to become a little more concrete in our conversation. Have you seen examples where that was the case, where these criteria were in place, or where they could have been in place, but by poor design it ended up not working out, but you think the ingredients would have been there if it had been done the right way? Does anything concretely come to mind in the case of the Middle East for you?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples. So, I mean, the first two that immediately come to mind were actually not so far apart from one another. One of them, I'm sure Dr. Hassan will speak to more, and we're coming out with an edited volume where Dr. Hassan will be writing a chapter on the case study of southern Iraq. So I'm happy to send that to some of your audience members when that does come out. But the 2018 water crisis in Basra, in which about 120,000 people were hospitalized due to illnesses from waterborne diseases, did catalyze the government to essentially actually start moving forward with plans that had already been in place for many, many years, but had been long delayed because of corruption, bureaucracy, indecision, at every sort of level of decision making. And so now you actually see potable drinking water going to places in central and northern Basra. Much more needs to be done, but that was sort of the thing that created the change or started moving it. Likewise, in Libya, and we've talked a lot about Iraq and Libya and how tragic it is that these energy-rich countries have such unstable power in these countries. It's terrible. And so the electricity grid was actually collapsing a few years ago in Libya. And so there was an entire plan put in place to not just rehabilitate the turbines, but to actually start implementing, renewable energy and a renewable energy plan. But once they rehabilitated the turbines, the crisis was averted. People stopped, taking to the streets and setting fires. And that next stage of the plan never happened. So I think what needs to happen is just simply greater consistency, because what we often say with conflict is we have to wait for that ripe moment or even that crisis in order to move forward. But I think what we've seen time and time again in the Middle East is that we sort of provide that Band-Aid and then move forward with business as usual as people sort of leave the streets in protest. And so there needs to be some effort towards consistency. And I really liked what Jay was mentioning about providing carrots. And this is something that could be controversial in some aspects. But in the case of Yemen, for example, the water crisis there significantly predates the existing conflict. And we know that to save Sana'a as a capital city, there needs to be extensive water infrastructure put in place. So how can water infrastructure, the provision or the financing of water infrastructure that Sana'a needs, be part of a peace plan, be part of a way to get local authorities to behave better when it comes to water management more generally? How can we incorporate water issues into the peace building processes? There's questions about the MEDREC model, which very much looks into this, and I can speak to that maybe later, but essentially we need to stop operating like climate change and water is a separate track from the existing political issues at play, because they are one and the same. And so I think that there's negatives to that, but I think that there's also positives to that, because we can see linkage issues at play. And that's why you saw more cooperation, for example, between Turkey and Iraq in recent years over transboundary water sharing. It wasn't simply because Turkey just wanted to altruistically provide more water to Iraq. It was because there was cooperation on other issues as well. And so we need to start thinking about the economic integration of this region, which is the least economically integrated region in the world, because they need to have mutual gains. And so I think that, that is the case within borders, but that's also the case across borders. So again, if governments see mutual gains from them actually investing in infrastructure when it comes to climate change adaptation or mitigation, then they will move forward with that. If they do not see gains for themselves, they will not move forward with it. So we need to start evaluating what the motivations and incentives are for each of the stakeholders to move forward. But I think there's lots of different examples of that actually happening. So hopefully we can be more optimistic in the future.
Thanks so much, Natasha. A rich overview of examples. As you said, the mutual gains is an important aspect, but also the political element of it, outside pressure and other things can help see the mutual gains, if you will. As well, an important ingredient potentially. You'd also mentioned southern Iraq, so maybe it's a segue to Dr. Hassan. Dr. Hassan, I was wondering, so when you look back at your time in government and now as a keen observer of the environmental work and in a volatile context like Iraq, what are the recommendations you have for governments to achieve the outcomes that we just discussed in terms of seeing mutual gains and collaborating, as you said earlier, on a sustained level? What do you think needs to be done to achieve that? And perhaps if you want to, feel free to draw on the example of southern Iraq as well, as Natasha already mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, it's always easy to say when you are out of government. But even if you are in the government, it's always easier to say things and develop like plans and what have you. But it's very, very hard in transition nature of government to implement your vision. So I think at least that I had a vision and a group of people like-minded people. We had a vision, but it was very hard to implement in the time passed in Iraq. Of course, we all agree, I think, that no magical solution to our problems. They are all in need of all kind of things, whether it's finances, whether it is political stability, support, international cooperation, and what have you. So, but I can mention, for example, because I have Jay here and Andrew and Natasha, and also the wider audience, that international community, for example, focus and cooperation with Iraq is mainly on government, and government institutions are not that that good in implementing like new directions and what have you. So we need to shift this international, for example, support towards society, and of course we need to support the government so that we have political stability, so programs can be implemented for the benefit of the people. But including society, civil society is also very important. Andrew talked rightly about diversification of economy. So Iraq is single-sided economy based on petrol export, and we have been lucky recently in the recent years that the prices are high. But during my time, that 2017-18, the prices of oil were like less than $28 per barrel compared to 80 something, more than 90 perhaps barrel per day right now. So in my time, we did not have enough money to spend on projects. So my capital investment while I was the minister was nearly zero. It's just, operational type, paying salaries and what have you. This did not help, of course, in implementing, the ideas and what have you. But as I said in my first intervention, that the focus must be on basic services in Iraq right now. And we know that, the more you develop in this, the government cannot stop this expansion, sometimes randomly, of buildings and complexes and things like that. Even they encroach on like green areas, on agriculture areas. There is a lot of push for selfish reason, and because of widespread corruption, they change the land use, for example, for that from agriculture into urban or whatever. As all these needs to be stopped, as political or financial or whatever, to get involved in this unless very clear environmental impact assessment becomes available. And
well, it appears we may have just lost Dr. Hassan. Here we go. Dr. Hassan, we lost you for a second.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. Yes, so we also need to do, we need to help make this shift in the society from like flood mitigation, flood culture that extended over thousands of years into a society who can survive and live on shortage of water in a time of scarcity. So this is very, very difficult task. That's why we have sometimes, social conflicts between, say, for example, people who want to restore the marshes to their full extent in southern Iraq that needs more water, but also with rice growing, a tradition that extends over thousands of years. So this is also, Natasha mentioned the removal of these fish farming and what have you. This is also a very complex undertaking, because this has direct link to the food security and food prices in the market. And fish is essential food in Iraq. So one need to be really very balanced in this to help Iraqis, shift and change their culture, whether it is, rice growing or fish growing or whatever. So Iraq also is, of course, is a member of a number of international conventions, including the UNFCCC, and while it lack of capacity to basically adopt to the conditions in this convention, but also the UNCCD, which is legally binding convention. But Iraq has so far, in my view, did nothing in terms of this, legally binding convention in terms of fighting or combating desertification. Desert is expanding in unprecedented proportion in Iraq, and the green cover is shrinking. So what concrete recommendation I can present to you right now is a lot of directions we need. Whichever direction we go, they are also linked together. So we have to deal with the water scarcity, expanding desert, creating jobs, providing basic services. So these are multiple of directions that the government should focus on, and I guess the international community should be able also to assist Iraqis on this.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hassan. A lot of insight into the political side of things and where the tracks can be put in the right direction to help facilitate climate action in environments like Iraq. Thanks very much for that insight. Jay, I think it brings us to some of the things you've said as well, and in your capacity, especially as a banker who deals so much with public officials and with governments all over the world, you share a lot of advice on how these things can be done. And now we just heard from Dr. Hassan what governments should focus on to make the changes necessary to adapt to the environment and the changes we're seeing there. So when you sit down with governments, especially governments of fragile and conflict-affected contexts, what would you recommend to them to facilitate climate finance flows, to perhaps create a pipeline of projects, to make projects more bankable, just to attract more finance and to be more forward-leaning in their efforts to address the climate crisis in these contexts? What would be a couple of points of advice that you would share with these government officials?
Well, I do think the harsh reality is we have to distinguish between countries that are in deep conflict in zones where attracting financial capital that is driven off of a return is within the realm of the ability to mitigate versus those that aren't. And I think we should, we have enough difficulty getting capital to move to, let's just say in financial terms, a double B country, and trying to then take private sector capital and mitigate it to the point that it can go to the most fragile, deeply distressed, Libya, for example, I think is almost a step too far. And I think that not that there aren't some parties, as I said earlier, that are on the ground, and both investors and corporations that will invest and potentially can invest more. But if we're really looking at the billions to trillions challenges of climate change, I think that the development banks are struggling to mitigate risk of a private sector just to get them to invest in non-investment grade countries and to mitigate that risk. And that we need to double down to get the multilateral development banks to help mitigate that risk. I do think, though, that since so many of you on this call listening are conflict negotiators that and involved in fragile and conflict countries, that being able to develop projects and find the NGOs, the aid organizations that will put the studies around viable projects, be they adaptation, be they water, whatever that are developmental and humanitarian, that get at the nexus of conflict, water, climate, that we're not doing enough of that. And so we have to supercharge the investment in, I think, very much in creating projects that can be made viable, that get at the core of this challenge. One of the things, though, I tell the ministers on a regular basis is to understand the political prism of the donors and of the developed world, and to make the case on terms that, and you all as negotiators will understand this, and Natasha, I think was fantastic in her game theory, talking about the prisoner's dilemma. One of the ways I think we make the case is through the peril case. It's something that in my work with Gavi and the COVAX facility during the COVID crisis, that Seth Berkley did extremely well. He made a case that we're not safe. I'm not safe until we're all safe. And if you put that case in terms here, your peril is refugees. If you're talking to Europe, if you're talking to developed countries, and if you can make the case of what's happening in terms of your need for funds, something that Gavi did extremely well, was to make that case of what it is that is your threat. And if you want to avoid a kind of a 2015, 2016 a refugee crisis and add zeros to the kind of threat, then I do think making the case to the developed world that these funds are not just a humanitarian case. And I'm on the board of Save the Children. I make the case every day that conflict is, the children and the women are on the front lines, and they are suffering. And so there is that humanitarian case. In parallel, though, we've got to make the case of the tragedy of the horizon. It's something that Michelle Walker talked about in her book called The Gray Rhino. So you're staring at the gray rhino, and as a game theory, we just stare at it, and you tend not to act until it moves. And so we have to be provocative in creating, in our negotiations, actions before the rhino charges you. And this is the story. It was the story of the pandemic. It is now the story of our time, is the coming conflicts that result from inaction and resolving the series of climate-related negative consequences. And so again, I think that for adaptation monies, for vulnerable country monies, for conflict monies, we have to do a better job of telling, as I said earlier, this promise or peril dilemma. We have to make the case of what this peril really means. And that's why I think Andrew's book ought to be sent to kind of every decision maker in the world to understand what happens if we don't address this nexus.
Thank you very much, Jay. Very clear call for action here that I appreciate very much. Also, a good perspective to provide just in terms of the risks and what it takes for private sector investment, private sector finance to be able to be unlocked, and the role of development banks in some sort of blended finance approaches perhaps is a very good perspective here. Thanks for adding that. Andrew, before we open up to the Q&A, and we already have quite a few Q&A, thanks colleagues, and please feel free to keep adding to the very long list. We won't get to all of them, but very interesting, so please feel free to share your questions. Andrew, I know you are also not a fan of staring at the great rhino and waiting until it charges at you, and that's a big part of why I wrote the book, and try to find action, try to find entry points, what we can do. So that's a lot of what you talk about in your book and the reason behind it. So when you deal with these issues and look at what it means for an organization such as Berghof and many other peacebuilding organizations like ours. We've been around this field for a while now. What are the things you draw from these conversations? Why is it so important to us? And what do we do with this? What does our field, the peacebuilding community, what do we do with these bits of information and the accelerating pace of the climate crisis? What does it mean for us, and what do we do about it?
Thank you. Well, I do think that the peacebuilding mediation world has a lot to do, but it's somehow it may be less than when I hear Jay talking, and the role of the private sector and the multinational banks and all of these institutions probably can do much more than small conflict and peacebuilding organizations are capable of doing, but we are doing our bit. But it's been early days. Environmental peacebuilding, that is a topic that for this audience, I won't have to explain it. Normally when I talk about this topic, I do have to explain it, but I'm sure people who are listening do not need to hear what it is. But I feel that this is a growth industry, as it were. I think that there is a lot of scope for this. We are doing it, not in as many places as I would like. We're doing it actively in Somalia, a member of the Arab League, and not generally considered part of the Middle East, but still part of the Arab League, and very much in Iraq, southern Iraq, where it involves getting two communities or different factions of warring parties together and to sit down and, first of all, to ensure that they have a common understanding of what they're living with. I mean, everybody knows that the world is getting hotter. They all feel that the droughts are getting worse, the subsequent floods that lead to recruitment to extremist organizations. People are aware of that. They don't necessarily know. They certainly don't know why. They don't necessarily know that it's part of even a nationwide trend, let alone a global-wide trend. And just the very fact of getting to understand these points can make people more open to sitting down with people who historically they don't like, who are rivals for resources or different ethnicity or a different sect. And somehow we are seeing instances where people are more open to having these dialogues, these mediated dialogues, whereby they can understand more about climate change. And at the same time, they can see that their hardships are not the result of their rivals, but of some greater force. But hopefully, and we're seeing this, for example, in areas of southern Iraq, where people have been forced to leave their homes because of desertification, the fact that their farms are now completely useless as a result of being covered by sand and dust and coming in. But the communities to which they are moving, as elsewhere in the world, don't obviously welcome these people, and so tensions grow up between them. We are putting them together and seeing how they can come together, first of all, understand that their hardships are not caused by the other, but then seeing what else they can do, whether it's some irrigation project or a desalination project or somehow a creation of renewable resources, how this type of peace building can not only reduce tensions and understand the great force of climate change, but actually come together to try to get through this terrible experience and see if they can somehow, through some adaptation strategies, can be carried out in partnership with people they don't like. So I think that this is a fairly recent development. Environmental peace building hasn't been practiced for very long and not in very many places. But I do think there's going to be a need for a lot more of it. At the moment, the big donor organizations and countries are not that switched on to it, frankly. The German government, and we're based in Berlin, so we're lucky to be able to work with them on this, is perhaps an exception. But in the other countries that are most interested in supporting peace building and mediation, most of them are not really yet, it's not yet on their radar what environmental peace building can bring.
Thanks so much for that, Andrew. I think it's a good place to end our panel segment. As you said, there's a long road ahead. It's a field that has been around for a little while, but not very long in the bigger scheme of things. And collectively, we have a long way to go, a lot to learn. We heard a lot about the different ways through which climate action or climate risks, peace building and finance interconnect. It's a very challenging interplay, of course. It's a lot of different actors required to make headway. We heard about the political challenges, some of the technical challenges. We heard about the need for long-term sustained investment, long-term sustained action, a track record that allows people in a game theory example, as Natasha shared, to consistently make the decision for cooperation over escalation, to see mutual gains and to create mutually beneficial solutions. There's a lot more that could be said, and I don't want to take away, though, any time from our Q&A. We have about slightly less than half an hour left. We have to end at the half-hour mark sharply. But we have a few questions here. Thanks, colleagues, for putting so many in. As I said, unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll pick up a few and direct them at our panelists. For all of the panelists, please, if you want to jump in on any of the questions, of course, please do so. Maybe I start with a question on Yemen. And Natasha, you've worked on a range of countries, on a range of countries in the Middle East. Here's a question about the climate crisis in Yemen and to what extent we can call it a man-made crisis as a result of the ongoing conflict. How do you think about that part of it, but also specifically with relation to communities? How can we ensure that the impacts on local communities, on individuals, is mitigated in an already very difficult circumstance?
Thank you. And is it all right if we answer a few of the questions sort of together? Because there was quite a few very, very good questions here, yeah. And I hope we get to them. I mean, in the case of Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, there were questions about all of these different countries. All countries, some of them experiencing ethnic cleansing at the moment. And so we need to understand that there's a lot of challenges there. And I think Jay is absolutely right, and obviously Andrew's book, that it's our job to express what the peril is for all of us collectively in terms of migration, in terms of instability, if we do not actually address these issues in a sustainable and equitable way. So not just preventing violence in the near term, but moving towards a more positive peace. And I think that's the part that's missing in much of this. And that goes for Yemen as well, because as I said earlier, the water crisis in Yemen predated the existing conflict. The problem is that the existing conflict is preventing further investment, and it's breaking society down even further. So traditional methods of irrigation based on the flage system, where everyone was mutually benefiting from the rains, has broken down. And there are certain farmers that are using more, that have diesel and they have solar pumps and they're able to dig deeper and deeper. And you have the same situation in many other countries where basically you see less people benefiting from agricultural livelihoods, but you see the same amount of water being used. And that is because of inequitable distribution of resources. So, and I think we need to really understand that, because I think a lot of times, you know, from the DC perspective, we had high-level officials less than a year ago saying that this was the calmest the region had ever been. And I'm not sure which region they were looking at, because the region was highly unstable. But I think if you're not paying attention to the people that are living on 3 liters of water a day, as they are in many parts of Yemen, this is under the WHO emergency threshold, then you're going to be consistently surprised by recidivism into conflict. And those of us who are working on the ground and have been for some time are less surprised. So I think, and we just came out with a report called Surviving Scarcity, which shows just how different it is between average consumption of water in the region and the consumption of vulnerable communities. Both are bad, but for vulnerable communities, it's far worse. And so I think we just need to continue to make the plea that water and climate change needs to be an absolute integral part of peace building efforts in the region. But I did want to speak to one other thing, if I could. I think that there's a difference between sustainable and equitable cooperation, which is what we should be aiming for, and the acquiescence of weaker parties or unsustainable solutions. And I'll give 2 examples, a big one and sort of more domestic ones. Someone mentioned the Green-Blue Peace Deal. This is a deal between Jordan and Israel, which is on hiatus at the moment, which would essentially allow Jordan to build a solar farm and export renewable energy to Israel. Israel would provide desalinated water to Jordan. Israel would provide 20% of Jordan's water resources, whereas Jordan would provide 2% of Israel's energy resources. This deal has been highly touted. The issue with it is that Israel doesn't need energy, and Jordan very much needs energy. And we've seen these multilateral deals fall apart over and over again, and Jordan has ended up in crisis mode over and over again. So we need to understand the difference between creating interdependencies and creating dependencies, which are highly, highly vulnerable to conflict and the political situation on the ground. And so I think that we need to keep that in mind before we sort of promote different deals that could lead to a crisis. And that goes for, I think, also peace building on the ground at the local community level. For a long time, we've built peace by digging more wells so that communities have more to benefit from, so that they don't, conflict over water. We've distributed solar pumps in conflict-affected areas so that people can pump groundwater. The issue with this is it's unsustainable at this current moment. It was a way to build peace and avoid conflict in the immediate term, but we're at a situation where we're seeing groundwater levels depleted by meters and meters between, I think it was 2006 and 2009. The largest freshwater losses in the world were in the Middle East, and that was primarily due to groundwater losses. So we need to really start paying attention to what we're doing in a holistic sense, rather than just trying to achieve that near-term peace. And that's very difficult, but we do need to do that.
Thanks so much, Natasha. That's a very useful perspective. Keeping the big picture in mind, not getting sidetracked by sort of smaller objectives along the way that might actually not give us what they promised maybe initially. So thanks for sharpening also the distinction between creating dependencies and interdependencies. Another question, maybe wrapping a couple of questions into one. And Andrew, maybe I'll start with you on this one, but others, please feel free to jump in as well. It's about, so one is about making sure that adaptation interventions do not, in fact, exacerbate conflict or insecurity. What type of guardrails can you imagine? And at Berghof, we're trying to work on some of these issues. How can we help advise to make sure that adaptation interventions do not, in fact, add to conflict dynamics? And linked to that, perhaps, climate justice. To what extent is climate justice a framing to keep in mind in this context? Specifically, we're talking about adaptation, but writ large as well. Climate justice, do you think is a useful framing to add to this discourse?
I was just going through the questions, and Nabil Hattari's question on environmental justice is a very, very important one. I regard climate justice as one of the weapons, as it were, to mobilize opinion in the industrialized world. To take, I mean, the statistic that I like to use is that I read not long ago that Somalia, which is one of the world's worst affected countries by climate change, has produced the same amount of emissions in the last 64 years as Americans have in the last 2.5 days. And that, for me, is sort of what one tries to do to wake up. In my own country, the UK was the first country in the world to industrialize, the country I live in, Germany, soon after, and the Americans, that there is a major obligation on the part of those countries that industrialized first, and therefore started emitting the greenhouse gases that are still up in the atmosphere, to help those who are suffering and yet did not create it. So I think environmental justice is a very, very important way to frame it. But I have to say, I don't think it's that relevant when we're talking about countries like Iraq, because there we're talking about countries that actually do have, compared to many countries in Africa, a very significant carbon footprint. So in that sense, it is not necessarily, we're not going to get people to understand that there is a massive injustice that needs to be rectified by helping Iraqis. So when it comes to helping Iraqis, which I really, really want to do, I think actually environmental justice is not necessarily the way to go. There was also a very interesting question by Abdel Fattah Ali on Sudan. And of course, it's sort of recently been said that the war in Darfur in the first decade of the century, that's now flared up again in a terrible, terrible way, was not only the first genocide of the 21st century, but also perhaps the first climate war, in the sense that one of the driving factors behind Darfur was the fact that farmers and herders from very different ethnic groups were competing over the same land, and that one ethnic group therefore carried out a genocide against the other. But in today's Sudan, we're now talking essentially about two men who are ready to destroy their country and put literally millions of people into famine and even death by starvation by, in the case of one of them, Hemeti, carrying out major violations of international human rights law, i.e. war crimes. But in the case of both of them, including the government that is now recognized by several governments in the United and the UN, both of them are not allowing humanitarian assistance in the full knowledge that by not letting that humanitarian assistance in, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of deaths between now and September. And so therefore, for us to be discussing, I think, environmental peace building in the context of Sudan now would not be the right thing to be doing. I'm, as you can tell, I'm deeply convinced of its importance. But right now, for Sudan, I wouldn't want to. I think there's a much more immediate goal that we have to handle first.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll carry the question over to you, Dr. Hassan, as well. So one about the question on you shared some of those thoughts already on adaptation to be conflict sensitive in the context of Iraq. And then there were a few questions about water. To your knowledge, what do you think current efforts on ensuring water supply, shoring up water security in Iraq, to what extent does groundwater play a role in these efforts? And maybe also a word or two on the importance of potable water in cities. And we've, of course, seen water riots in Basra and other places in Iraq. Maybe a few words on water as well in the context of Iraq.
Yes. Yes, I noticed two questions regarding water strategy for Iraq. Yes, Iraq has a really good strategy, a 20-year strategy. It is called Land and Water Strategy in Iraq until 2035. How I have my own concerns about it, but we have like a roadmap towards 2035. My main concern that it is not like climate change sensitive approach. I mean, the projects listed on that strategy are not really inclined to address climate change. It was like written based on some old information up to the 60s and 70s. So it did not consider what happened later. And so it is in need of modification, updating. And I started that when I was minister, but of course I could not finish it. And I think the current ministry is also keen to update that. It needs a lot of work. However, as I said, political stability is not helping. Like, you know, my government, the government that I was part of, lasted for 2 years. The government that came after me, 1 year. And then the government afterwards, like 1.5 years. And we have a government that has not yet 2 years. And the change of the positions, and as I said, a quota system based on sects and ethnicities is not helping, like building up this experience to face up to the challenges. But we have a strategy. We are happy with what we have, but it needs modification. This strategy cater not only also for water, but also electricity and food. So there is some nexus there, but it is not really fine-tuned to the current formidable challenges of Iraq. For the second question regarding the groundwater, yes, we have quite reasonable groundwater. We estimate it to be like 4% of what we have of surface water. So this is quite good, but it is in terms of quality, is not that good. So I myself, I am running a small farm here in my area, and I use groundwater. So I cannot grow everything that I can. I need to find, some salt resistance plantation, or these orchard or date palms, or olive olive oil, olive trees and things like that. But it's not very successful. I could not be a successful farmer, but I tried it myself. I'm still trying with the difficulties. So I advise for like the widespread use of groundwater, but of course it has to be sustainable. So the government, the Minister of Water Resources, has to intervene in this to ensure sustainable utilization of groundwater. We also need to diversify the sources. It's not only surface water and groundwater. Groundwater now, recently became important in Iraq. Nobody cared about groundwater before, but now because of water scarcity, because of the control upstreams of water and declining inflow, so people are going to the, but it's not within a strategy and what have you, but just it was dictated by the need on a daily basis or season basis or yearly basis. So this need to be taken into account, and make the ministry or the ministries relevant needs to do some effort in here. And of course, Iraq, the water sector in Iraq itself is not that like consolidated. We have many stakeholders in the sector, like the Minister of Water Resources, which is responsible of bulk waters, but we have Ministry of Housing, Construction, and municipalities responsible for drinking water. We have the so-called Amanat al-Asima, which is the mayoralty of Baghdad, as a separate entity. We have also decentralized utilities, whether in terms of execution or operation, is at the hand of local authorities, and the management of the entire water in the hand of like the central government. So we have a lot of work here when it comes to governance that need to be addressed. As for the event of Basra, Natasha mentioned twice. I was the Minister of Water Resources back then. But this incident happened in the distribution network of drinking water. It's not in the bulk water that I was managing. This is not just to defend myself or my ministry, but the issue of governance is very important. People did not know that the water in the distribution system belongs to a different ministry. But because the Minister of Water Resources has the word water in it, and there was contaminated water comes to the houses, so the Minister of Water Resources gets blamed for the thing. So this, shifting of the blame also, get, some opportunistic politician to use it to defend themselves and the responsibilities of the local authority, for example, in this. Luckily, nobody died, although more than 100,000 people get impacted, but nobody died. But I think that was also a catalyst to for the local authority also to address this more and be like forthcoming. But the chaotic of politics in Iraq get people to forget easily what happened, and then they got engaged with the new challenges, like right now, for example, summertime, lack of electricity, lack of water, and things like that. So they forgot what happened like last year or 2 years ago, and what have you. This dynamics in our society is very disturbing, in my view, in terms of developing strategies for sustainable development. But Iraq is developing. Like I can give you just an example. Internally, like for example, back in 2003, 4, 5, perhaps, the piece of land in Baghdad could cost $10,000 to buy a house. Now you can't afford because houses, the same houses, are worth millions of dollars. So and people are making money. So there is a lot of added value when Iraq became like market economy, but it is still chaotic. Very few people are making unimaginable profit. Also, people under the poverty line, like they just increase the number. And but there are building, there are whatever projects, but it is not considering the environment always. And this is my main concern here.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. It sounds like the housing crisis is also coming to Iraq, but thank you for sharing more on the governance side of things again with respect to water. Jay, I'd like to come to you. There was a question or a point rather made in a Q&A about the need to prioritize perhaps humanity over profits. And that's especially interesting, I think, with your background, because the need, you mentioned earlier, the billions and trillions, the need for that kind of investment in climate finance, a large chunk of that we know will have to come from the private sector and private finance. So when we think about prioritizing humanity over profit, is there a role for the international community to set the parameters to allow for that to happen? You mentioned already some experiences from COVAX, for instance, and Gavi, and how that was able to mobilize some of the finance. We're gearing up for COP29 in Baku. You mentioned the new collective quantified goal will be negotiated there. Is there an expectation, you think, that there will be parameters developed that would allow the private sector to invest more of the funding and to make a case that both public and private sector funding can collectively address the need going forward, especially in those below investment grade contexts?
There's a lot in there. Let me see if I can unpack a handful of those issues. So I think first, as Andrew referenced, and I mentioned earlier, I think to develop the political consensus to act, we have to address the parties at the table, so to speak, on terms they understand and can relate to, and therefore addressing the private sector investors. One can appeal to a Ilya Foundation, a humanitarian cause component, a do good, do well component, and continue to drive that toward increased investment flows from the private sector. But that's not where the pot of gold is. I think the large monies move when we can actually create opportunities that drive jobs and therefore economic development, that drive investment on terms that economically drive the creation of jobs such that the causes that we all care about continue to be served. And so whether it's through the enabling environment reforms that make countries more investable, whether it's through the peace negotiating process that you all do, one has to, or the multilateral development bank community continuing to mitigate risks such that investors can invest more. We've got to get at this problem from different prisms. And I think when you relate it though to the new collective quantified goal, I'm deeply concerned that we're not making enough progress toward Baku. In fact, I think that when I listen to the negotiators in the developed world, some of the ministers that are talking about Baku and the move from Copenhagen to the new collective quantified goal, I'm deeply, deeply concerned that we just can't get there. I just don't understand how we get there, given how people are talking now. But what does that have to do with conflict? One is it's interesting. One of the reasons that senior officials will give about the lack of preparedness and the gaps on preparation for Baku is in fact the various conflicts around the world right now, and the bandwidth and the resource absorption of those conflicts. So whether it's Ukraine, Gaza, the threats of Iran, China, that those concerns are overwhelming in their nature. And so it's interesting when we talk about the tragedy of the horizon again, we have to make the case that those conflicts will continue to spiral and broaden if we don't address them. And second, I think when I look at what we talked about at another kind of the tragedy of the common discussion here, and the success that we had, not perfect as it may have been with Gavi and COVAX, but we did have a framework for the response of the developed world to the pandemic was to decide quickly who funded what, who was capable of paying for their own vaccines, who was capable of funding others, and who required aid and vaccines to be funded by others. So we created a parameter around that and an allocation methodology that just tells me the world is absolutely capable of that. But right now, we don't have that framework and that agreement in the conflict world. And one of the interesting things is that Mia Motley and others, the V20 initiative, many of you may be familiar with, have made the case in the SIDS, right, the small island developing states, that vulnerable countries to extreme weather should be a new category. So we should be thinking about them. So you may not be the poorest country on the planet, but you are actually going to be underwater in however many years. And therefore you're a special case that needs to be understood. I'm unaware of a similar bucketing of conflict and of throwing into the negotiation a group of countries that their climate dynamic is so severe that they're vulnerable to conflict in a way that, as we talk about the bucketing within the provisioning of the new collective quantified goal framework, that we need to, and some of you mentioned, how do we think about adaptation so it doesn't do harm? I would be a little bit more bolder and look at the promise of what could you do to prevent conflict if we actually had resilience monies that took the prism of conflict for a group of countries in mind, and said that those need to be funded. And how can we look at that heavy government, meaning in the provision of the new collective quantified goal? How can we look at that and target it for the needs that we're talking about today of resilience and prevention of future conflict?
Thank you, Jay. Thanks very much for that perspective. I hope there is time, or there's definitely time, and I hope they use the time while negotiators to get to the point we all wish to go ahead of Baku. It is now 4:30 European time, 10:30 US time, and all over the world, I think we've come to the end of this webinar right now. A big thank you to the panelists. Thank you very much for sharing your rich insights and experience on this topic. It's been enlightening. Thank you also to all participants, all the great questions asked. A big apology to all the questions we didn't get to. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time. We could have used another hour or two to get through all the questions and really get the most out of our panelists. Hopefully there'll be another chance, another time. But for now, thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day. And thanks again for joining. See you soon.